Good afternoon, everyone, or indeed good morning, depending on where in the world you are joining us from here in sunny Aberdeen. So welcome virtually to the University of Aberdeen. I'm Hannah Burrows. I'm a senior lecturer here in the History Department and Director of the Centre for Scandinavian Studies. And I'm also the programme coordinator for our postgraduate talk programme, our master's programme in Scandinavian Studies, which focuses on the Viking and medieval period. And so I'm going to be chatting to you today about the topic of Viking humour. I'm going to talk for maybe 20 or 30 minutes so that there is plenty of time for you to ask questions, either about the content of the talk or about our programmes if you would like to. So please feel free to be typing questions in the chat as I'm talking or after I finish talking. Jacinta is moderating questions for us, so don't worry if your question doesn't appear immediately. It will be published, just so we're not kind of deluged with questions, but I won't be taking any until after I've finished speaking. All right, I'm just going to get my presentation going. There we go. Oops. So in the year 982 or thereabouts, a character called Eiríkr in the rauði, Eirik the Red, was outlawed from Iceland for a period of 3 years. And he decided that he would use this time, when he was in exile, to follow up rumours that he had heard of a new land to the west, the region we now know as Greenland. He spent his 3 years exploring the coastline, returned to Iceland, and decided it was a suitable place to set up a new colony, which he could be in charge of. So he was trying to recruit people to go over with him and set up a new settlement. And we're told in his saga that summer, Eiríkr set off to colonise the country he had discovered. He named it Greenland, for he said that people would be much more tempted to go there if it had an attractive name. And just to note the Google Maps image we have of Iceland and Greenland, you might wonder which one is Greenland after all. Now, is this an example of humour? It perhaps seems funny to us because we are familiar with marketing speak and jokes about estate agent speak, where a view towards the sea means, well, you might see the sea if it weren't for the 5 miles of concrete high-rise flats between you and it, or needs some love and attention means it's falling down around your ears. But would it have been seen as funny in the medieval period when the saga was written down? Maybe it was just seen as sensible. The area where Eiríkr chose to settle probably had a similar climate, had similar conditions to the west coast of Norway, where Eiríkr had originally come from as a boy, and where his colleagues would be well accustomed to living and farming. The tongue-in-cheek and slightly cynical tone of the saga is quite characteristic of the sagas of Icelanders, however, so we might expect that there is some underlying tongue-in-cheek humour there. But is it Viking? Eiríkr is a kind of archetypal Viking in some ways. He certainly lives in the heart of the Viking Age, and he sets off to explore a new land. But of course, the records of what he said and did don't come until much later. The saga is probably written in the 13th century and exists in 2 manuscripts, one of which is early 14th century and one of which is 15th century. So can we be sure that what he said actually is what he said? So is the title of my talk therefore a similar marketing ploy as to that which Eiríkr employed? Did I name it Viking humour so people would be much more tempted to come because it had an attractive name? Well, I hope not. What I would like to talk about to you today are 2 things. One are the problems and possibilities of accessing humour from the Viking Age, and one is to explain how humour about the Viking Age, which is constructed in the medieval period, perhaps still influences our view of the Viking Age today. of course, the image goes to prove that the image we have of Vikings and the Viking Age is a stereotypical but persistent one, despite all the evidence to prove that, or to suggest that Vikings didn't have horns on their helmet. We persist in seeing these images because that's how we know we're talking about Vikings, right? So I'd like to start with a working definition of humour in the sense that I'm going to be using it today. Now, of course, humour somewhat is in the eye of the beholder. That's what having a sense of humour is. Something I find funny is not necessarily something you're going to find funny, and vice versa. Okay, so we can't ever talk about a kind of universal sense of humour that everyone would definitely have laughed at or definitely not have laughed at. I'm also not going to talk about things that are seen as kind of universally funny. That's a bit of a controversial term, but perhaps things like, you know, jokes about bodily functions or people falling over, slipping on a banana skin, whether or not you think that's funny, seems to be kind of remarkably persistent images that children everywhere have laughed at and some people never grow out of. I want to talk about humour that is intentional. There is some rhetorical intent behind it, so not kind of accidental humour, something that is deliberate. And I will argue that humour is socially, culturally and historically contingent, so not universal. It depends on what we're accustomed to, what our values are, what our norms are, what we're worried about, and so on and so forth. I'd also like to point out that laughter does not necessarily equal funniness, right? A kind of emotion of amusement. So we might laugh because we're nervous, we might laugh at a joke out of politeness, we might laugh out of a fear of looking stupid that we don't get the joke. So there's not a straightforward correlation between laughter and funniness and humour. Now, does humour equal funniness? Again, this is a bit of a contentious point. And I am going to take, for the purposes of this talk, the argument that it doesn't necessarily, but an intention to provoke laughter of some sort is important. Okay, so it might be the laughter of scorn, or, you know, a kind of to laugh at someone, whether you think the joke has been hilariously funny or not, but there's a deliberate attempt to provoke laughter or some kind of emotion behind it. So that's how I'm defining humour. I'll also talk about these other contentious terms. So as I am sure many of you watching know, Viking does not equal early Scandinavian person, and there are passionate debates about how we should use the word Viking or whether we should use the word Viking. The Viking Age, depending on who you ask and where you are, can be said to run roughly between the late 8th century to the mid 11th century. So what I'm going to be talking about really is Viking Age humour, rather than humour that can be attached to a particular group of people that identify as Vikings or can be identified as Vikings. You may well have heard the kind of adage that Viking is a profession or a job description, not an ethnicity. That's true, but if we're talking only about the kind of early sources, then the word Viking is hardly ever found actually in the early sources, and applies to a much narrower range of people than we use it to talk about now. So I'll be talking about humour that, as far as we can tell, is from or about the Viking Age. But many of my sources come from the medieval period, and again, periodization is not exact, runs to maybe the end of the 15th century and then we enter the early modern period. But for my purposes, most of the sources come from the 13th or 14th century anyway, so we're kind of well within that period. But the Icelandic sagas, for instance, which provides much of the source material, are written about the Viking Age from the 9th and between the 9th and 11th centuries. So whether that's the settlement period of Iceland or whether it's the king's sagas talking about kings during the Viking Age, which are the main things I'm going to be focusing on. So how do we access Viking humour? There are a few documentary records from inside the Viking Age. It's an oral culture, and that's kind of important to what I'm going to be talking about. We can access Skaldic poetry, which is written down. It's preserved because it gets written down in later medieval texts, but it can often be dated to the Viking Age. So it's being passed down in oral tradition until it gets written down. Artwork and other archaeological finds, material finds from the Viking Age may be a way of accessing humour, but I'm not an archaeologist or an art historian, so I'm not going to be talking about that today, but that is another possible avenue for investigation. And Viking mythology or Old Norse mythology, as again you might know, is often quite amusing. The stories are quite amusing, but the telling of them is done by the 13th century author, historian and poet Snorri Sturluson, or the poems of the Poetic Edda are also preserved in medieval manuscripts. So I'm not going to talk about the myths today, although there is a very interesting narrative about making a giantess laugh. You can ask me about that in the chat, but it's not going to form part of my talk. So, as I say, those are the possible ways of accessing authentic records from the Viking Age, and I'll also be talking about later Old Norse humour that contributes to the image of the Viking. So, Skaldic poetry, as I've said, is preserved in later texts, but can also often be authenticated to the Viking Age, dated to the Viking Age on linguistic grounds. It has a very fixed form, very tight metrical and other linguistic rules that help it to be preserved in that form. And it's full of a formulaic but creative use of language. So it uses lots and lots of synonyms, poetic synonyms called heiti, and these periphrastic phrases called kennings, which are kind of roundabout ways of describing something. So very common one in Skaldic poetry is to call a ship the horse of the ocean. Okay, so you don't actually refer to a ship, but you refer to kind of something it's like in a different context. So it really, really lends itself to lots of wordplay, lots of puns, lots of double meanings, lots of sexual innuendo and other kinds of disguised or ambiguous meanings. So you can look like you're saying one thing, but actually be saying another in Skaldic poetry. It's very witty, it's a very clever kind of art form. The Skald could play with language to show off their linguistic skill. It also lends itself to insult because it's hard and because it has all of these built-in ambiguities, so you can kind of insult someone without them necessarily realising it straight away. And we find it used for libel. So verses, the Skaldic poetry is designed to be memorable. It's designed to praise Norwegian kings and to commemorate their great deeds. But domestically, back home in Iceland, it could also be used to preserve things that people would rather forget. So when we're in an oral society, words are really, really important. And in an honour-based society, one's reputation is really, really important. So if someone says something bad about you in poetry and it's likely to be remembered forever, this is a big problem for you. So an example of a Skaldic verse, here's one from Grettis saga Ásmundarsonar, and this is an interesting one because the verse actually identifies within itself that it's an entertaining verse or a fun verse. So often it's hard for us to tell whether something was supposed to be funny or not. But this is an unusual example where the verse actually says it's an entertaining verse. So the story at this point is that the hero Grettir, the eponymous hero Grettir, has just found out that he's been outlawed throughout Iceland. So he is trying to make his escape and he has to steal a horse belonging to a farmer called Svein. Svein just comes into the story at this point for the purposes of the plot. We don't know much about him except the saga tells us that he is a cheerful person and he likes to compose amusing verses. So we get this little sequence where Grettir is riding away on Svein's horse and Svein is kind of trying to catch up with him, and they're each leaving verses of poetry for each other along the way, and they both seem to be finding it quite amusing. So this is what the verse says. Well-born goddess of gold. So in this case, Grettir is leaving this stanza of poetry as a kind of message for Svein with just a kind of random farm woman. Well-born goddess of gold, tell this amusing verse to the shepherd of the sea flame. Okay, so that's one of these kennings. Sea flame is gold. The shepherd of gold, person who looks after gold, is a man, so Svein. The eel of the hollow has snatched his horse away. The snake has snatched his horse away. What's going on there? The bold-worded giver of Odin's ale, that's Grettir, the poet, will ride that mare so furiously that I'll spend the night at Gilsbacki. So he'll ride so hard that he'll be able to get far away by night time. So this has caused a bit of confusion. So for instance, Heather O'Donoghue has written about this episode and what's really funny about it. The fact that it's about stealing a horse, which isn't really a laughing matter, and it's kind of the Grettis pointing out that he's a poet is commemorating it in poetry. This could potentially be problematic. So there are a few things that we might identify as amusing here. The wordplay, perhaps the fact that Grettir is calling his rival here, Svein, the shepherd of the sea flame, the shepherd, the looker after of something that's really hard to look after. That's a hint about him stealing a horse. The fact that he's addressing a kind of ordinary farm woman as a goddess of gold, which is a kind of standard kenning in court poetry for a queen. The mismatch of register might be what's amusing here. And there's wordplay on Grettir's own name. So he calls himself the eel of the hollow, which is a way of talking about a snake, and a word for snake in Old Norse is Grettir, which is his own name. So there's plenty of wordplay going on here, but it's still not exactly kind of all about laughing hilariousness. And in fact, we might expect Svein to react with some anger at this verse because it's commemorating something embarrassing that's happened to him, or something potentially shameful that's happened to him. And there's a very fine line between what's a joke and what's offensive. So as I said, if I'm counting humour as something that involves an intention to provoke laughter, then mockery and ridicule is counted in that. It might not be, the target might not be laughing at it, but it might be intended to cause people to laugh at the target. And even socially performative laughter can signal that type of humorous intent. Now, the context as to whether or not we know someone found something funny tends to come from the later saga prose. Okay, we don't usually get so many nice cues within the poetry itself as to whether it's funny or not. So the context is probably somewhat imagined as to whether it was found funny or whether it was found offensive. We have to try and work that out based on other types of clue. And because there's no Old Norse word for humour that can be directly translated as humour, I've recently done a semantic study of other kinds of words that might potentially signify the presence of humour or types of humour. And I found that most of them are on a spectrum, with things that can be taken in a kind of light-hearted and fun way, and things that are actually, borderline abuse, insult, mockery. So here's another instance from Hallfreðar's saga Vandræðaskálds. Hallfreðar is an attested historical figure. He's a court poet. We've got excellent poetry that he composed about Earl Hákon Sigurðsson in Norway and King Olafur Tryggvason. And his nickname means troublesome poet. So we've got a clue that he is also known for composing problematic poetry. So at this point, Hallfreðar is involved in love rivalry with a figure called Grettis, and Grettis has gone to the father of the woman that they're fighting over to ask for her hand in marriage, but Hallfreðar is also there, and he composes this verse about somebody in Grettis's party. So the anger of the truly unmanly, totally heathen sinker of many trousers, this Maud, the person that he's insulting, is about as terrifying before my eyes as if a largish old pantry dog was skulking outside by the pantry. Most of all at the coming of guests. I swell the poetry. So again, there's a deliberate attempt by the poet here to point out, look, I'm commemorating this forever. And we can see here, I mean, it might not be hilarious again, but he's calling him kind of an old pantry dog. There's a sort of intention to mock and to ridicule here. But the target Maud says, if he flimtedi han, if he libeled him. This word is often translated as kind of satire or mockery in English, but it seems to have a much stronger intent here, that it's actually a kind of problematic slander. So in this case, the word Eiríkr is used. I've bolded it there in the Old Norse in the second line. This is a really problematic word. It's hard to translate exactly. It definitely means, it's translated here as truly unmanly. It's much more insulting than that. In the later Icelandic laws, if somebody called you that, you had the right to kill them without any legal repercussions for you. So this is a really problematic kind of insult. But then we find a similar thing happening in Þorgils saga Skalda. Now this is one of the so-called contemporary sagas, so it's written in the early 14th century, but it's set in the 13th century, so this one isn't Viking Age. But a similar kind of dynamic goes on. We have two characters, Aron and Þorgils, and Aron is accusing Þorgils of cowardice, basically, and he says, I didn't expect this, that you would be rauði. So again, uses this very serious insult. And Þorgils replies, it seems to me you've spoken harshly by using that word, but I know that it was in jest and not your innermost conviction, so I will take it as a joke. Now, there's actually no sign that Aron did mean it as a joke, but Þorgils is able to stand back from that and say, look, it's fine, I'm going to take it as a joke. And intentionality, so whether somebody is deliberately being insulting, and the actions, whether somebody chooses to be insulting, seems to be really important. So Grail, which is again the later Icelandic law code, starts first written down in the 12th century, and the manuscripts that we have come from the 13th century. It prescribes full outlawry. That means you have to leave Iceland forever, or anyone has the right to kill you with no legal comeback. So it prescribes full outlawry for poetry if defamation or mockery is in it, and for spreading it about if it is deemed in mockery. So even the law can't define exactly what humour or what mockery is. It's kind of, there's an intentionality that's subjective about it. It also prescribes lesser outlawry, that's outlawry for a period of 3 years, for a mocking nickname if the target wants to get angry about it. So if you choose to be offended, then you can choose to prosecute. But if you don't, then it doesn't count. An instance from Ólafs saga Tryggvasonar, so that is set in the Viking Age again, has an incident. Actually, it's not that funny, really. Probably not that funny for the person it happens to. So the king actually pushes someone who is fully dressed in all this expensive finery into the sea. And he's not very happy about it, as you might imagine. But the king says, be cheerful and glad again, kinsman, because I did this for fun and amusement and not to mock you. So, you know, that we still have that now, don't you? It's only a joke. And I guess if the king tells you it's only a joke, then you have to laugh. So this whole kind of jibe of someone can't take a joke still stings now, right? And it's still seems to have stung very much at the time. But being able to laugh something off suggests an abundance of honour. You don't have to be worried about your reputation, about someone saying something bad about you, because you've got so much honour in stock that you can shrug it off. So Maud, for instance, in the first episode, the first stanza, he's likely to lose status against Hallfreðar because Hallfreðar is already really high status as a court poet. But Þorgils, and he is someone who is extremely concerned with his reputation, because at one point earlier in the saga, he actually says he'd be really disappointed if there wasn't a saga about him. So he's not only concerned with his reputation within his own society, but for posterity. He is kind of confident enough to say, okay, well, you called me that terrible insult, but I'm just going to take it as a joke. Stamps it out flat, doesn't go any further, very effective. So this shades into my second kind of point about the construction of the Viking Age through the use of humour. So according to the manuscript Fagurskinna, collection of King's sagas, this is an account of a battle involving the Jómsvikings, a kind of semi-legendary mercenary group in the 10th and 11th century. The Jómsviking, Jómsviking, so here we can have the label Viking quite safely. And they're in a battle against the Norwegians. The Jómsvikings are defeated and are kind of being lined up to be executed. So one of them comes forward for execution and said, "Ram." They asked, "Why do you say that?" He replies, "Many a ewe has been named by your men today, and so I wanted to get the ram for them." That was considered a funny and fearless thing to say. The Jarl asked if he wished for quarter so he can be pardoned, and he said that he did, and he gets it. Now, what on earth is happening here? I'm going to have to read this out, so make sure I get it right. So Alison Finlay, who's the most recent translator of this saga, explains it like this. So the word "ow," which is the accusative of "ayr," which means you, is also the exclamation "ow." So the young man's pun implies that the Norwegian cried out with pain in battle. So he's saying that, oh, they're talking about ewes, they're talking about female ship, ow, 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 ow. There's also likely a sexual innuendo here, putting the Jómsviking in the dominant role over the, by implication, effeminate Norwegians. Now, as strained as this witticism is in translation, the fact that the narrator has to point out that was considered a funny and fearless thing to say suggests that the saga compiler possibly also had his own problems grappling with Viking Age humour and thought that even his native-speaking audience might fail to be moved by or fail to even get the joke that's going on here. But the Jarl is impressed. He grants this young man his life. But interestingly, there is another version of this story in Jómsviking saga where the narratorial comment is absent and the guy is actually put to death. So it suggests that not everybody actually got all of these puns. But the point is that at the most terrifying point imaginable, this young man is able to make a joke. And we see this a lot in the construction of the heroic past in the Old Norse Icelandic sagas, where understatement and irony is a real feature. So, for instance, in Njál's saga, a man says to a newly bereaved widow, "I've just now made it that you can be married a second time." That's how he's announcing he's killed her first husband. "I have dealt with Ásmundarsomar's backache." He's killed Ásmundarsonar, so Ásmundarsonar doesn't have to worry about his backache anymore. And the threat, "You have a thin skull and I have a heavy axe," from Eiríkr saga. So all of these are kind of laughing in the face of terror and death. Now, a slightly different tack is, was this supposed to be funny? So two similar episodes, one from Njál's saga. Someone who's just had the part of their leg sliced off. "I've paid now," he says, "for being without a shield." Stood some while on his leg and looked at the stump. Kolskegg said, "There's no need to look, it is just as it appears to you, the leg is off." A similar one from Gunnlaug's saga. Gunnlaug then struck a great blow with a sword into Hram's side and cut the leg from under him. However, Hram did not fall, but rather withdrew to a tree stump and stood there on the stump. I mean, this seems a bit bizarre, a bit kind of, you sort of laugh with shock, or is it kind of a sick kind of humour going on here? But is it supposed to be funny? I think probably the Njál saga one, yes, and the Gunnlaug saga one, perhaps not. It's very dramatic in Gunnlaug's saga. The rest of the context suggests perhaps not. But I think it partly seems kind of amusing to us because we have had 800 years of kind of reception of this kind of image of the medieval, of the heroic past. We can't help almost but think of scenes like this from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, a kind of indefeatable, brave knights or Vikings in the saga case, who are just completely unfazed by losing one limb after another. So that kind of affects how we read the joke. But of course, the creators of Monty Python and the Holy Grail are very familiar with Old Norse literature, and no doubt their interpretation or their presentation here is influenced by presentations like that in the saga. So we see going on here and what's called an aestheticization of death. Death is being kind of cleaned up in a way, tidied up. And the film critic Margaret Bruder says this about Quentin Tarantino films, that they're stylistically excessive in a significant and sustained way. So the idea of ultra violence. And Tarantino himself says, one of the things I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get you to laugh at things that aren't funny. Okay, so if we think about the situation that many medieval Icelanders, so those who were writing and listening to the sagas, were dealing with, perhaps explains why we see this kind of aestheticization of death in the past. The contemporary sagas depict, so there's a kind of almost civil war period going on in Iceland. There's a lot of civil unrest, a lot of feuding. And the contemporary sagas describing that period describe maiming and injury and torture in much more graphic and unpleasant and realistic ways. But looking at the past, a kind of fantasy space, imagined space, there's this attempt to tidy everything up. There's a kind of painlessness about the deaths of the great heroes. So again, more and more examples of kind of laughing in the face of death. Again, from Njáls saga, Gizur looked at him, Þorgrim in this case, and says, "Is Gunnar at home?" Þorgrim answered, "You find that out. I found out that his spear's at home." So Þorgrim has been sent to find out if Gunnar is at home, been speared through with a spear. So he's found out that the spear's there, even if Gunnar's not. Similar situation in Grettis saga. Somebody pulls a spear out of their body and goes, "Oh, these broad spears are fashionable nowadays," sort of keels over. And Njáls saga, the account of someone having their head chopped off and still continuing to count their money as the head flies off. So this ties up with other images of a kind of golden age, heroic past, where heroes were heroes and pain was painless. So in this instance from Hallfreðar, one of the poems of the Poetic Edda, Hegni laughed then as they cut to the heart. They're cutting his heart literally out of his body. The living sculptor of scars. To cry out never entered his thoughts. So in this instance, there's nothing funny at all going on here. You know, he's not making a joke. He's not pretending to laugh at a joke. He's just laughing because it's kind of the opposite of crying. It's the kind of most opposite reaction that he could possibly have to being sad or hurt or afraid. So laughing in the face of danger and fearlessness in the face of death as images of Vikings that are constructed in the later medieval period are views that still stick with us today. I'm going to end there. Here is a slide for some more information about our master's programme in medieval studies. If you want to follow us on Facebook or on Twitter, how you can find us is detailed there. And I will now switch back to Jacinta and the chat, and please feel free if you have any questions to ask them there. Otherwise, thank you very much. Okay, question from Keith. Thanks, Keith. Would you say Vikings had a dark sense of humour, and did they use this to help them through dark times and dangerous battles? Yes, is the answer to that. I think I would say that. As I say, it's not always easy to match up the examples, the evidence that we have with people that were actually employed in Viking expeditions, but because the skalds, the court poets, were people who were often involved in the front line of the king's battles, for instance, they were taken along in order to be able to commemorate what's going on, then probably the ability to laugh at that or to create some kind of shared community. Humour is really important for that kind of thing, right? To share experiences in a way that is a kind of like an in-joke or an in-experience. I think that's a very important function, both of the poetry and the stories that grew up around it. Could those texts aimed at mocking certain individuals cause them to fight or have bad blood? Yes, they could, yeah. So again, we have poetry, so it's preserved in the sagas again, so that it's the later texts that give us the accounts of this kind of rivalry and feuding. But because a lot of the poetry can be authenticated to the Viking Age, then we know that that kind of poetry existed in the Viking Age. And in some cases, we can guess that the saga accounts of people who are kind of rivaling each other, it's often that you get an exchange of insulting verses. So one person will make one up, and then one person will make one up in revenge, and then the first person will get revenge for that, and so on and so forth. And sometimes you can maybe guess from like context or from clues within the verse that they are actually picking up on each other's language, so that the context that the saga tells us might not be that far-fetched. But yeah, so certainly, and again in the later laws, there's even a clause to say that in some situations that rather than fight over it, or rather than prosecute for it, the best thing to do is to just kind of make up a verse of your own to get your own back. What could possibly go wrong? But yes, no, definitely there are saga accounts. The poets' sagas, so-called poets' sagas, are quite focused on this idea of how a mocking verse can then escalate up into chains of violence. So yeah, absolutely, it was not something that was taken lightly, and it could very quickly get very serious indeed. Carl, question from Carl: do you think Vikings expected to have a good sense of humour? Do you think they were expected? Perhaps that is, and yeah, definitely. Again, I would say that if you're able to laugh something off, it perhaps suggests that you're so honourable already that you can take whatever insults people throw at you. You're expected to get some kind of revenge, probably. So if it's a really bad insult, if you just kind of lie down and take it, then your honour is going to be diminished by that. But if you can kind of neutralise it and almost turn it back, like the example from Þorgils saga, by almost diminishing what the importance of what he's saying, then Þorgils is able to kind of increase his own honour and make Aron, who's trying to mock him, look a bit silly. So yes, you would be expected to retaliate in some way, whether it's through violence or through humour yourself, kind of a counter joke, or by being so honourable and having so much self-confidence that you can actually dismiss what's being said about you. But I think that definitely contributes to the idea of honour and bravery. And like I say, with the examples of laughing in the face of death, then that's something that's seen as like the ultimate marker of bravery. All right, Kieran, what type of thing may have offended a Viking? I was reading some Viking fiction today. One Viking called another a fool. He challenged him to a duel and killed him because of this. Would something as simple as this result in duels? Yeah, I mean, I guess like the later laws imply, it depends how much offence that you want to take from it, and probably how many other people laugh at it. So even something that seems quite minor and quite simple, if there was a big audience, say, and everybody laughed, and it suggested that that person really was being taken as a fool, then that could definitely count as something that they would need to then avenge, even possibly through physical retaliation. The laws suggest that what's kind of legitimate, as it were, to kill somebody for would be stronger words than that. But just because like there's the prescriptive law about something that comes from a later period anyway, doesn't necessarily reflect what people actually how people actually are going to react, so that there's potentially circumstances in which what seem like quite trivial insults might be taken in a much more serious way. Okay, another question. Were the skalds confronted about their insults and jokes? E.g., did they have to be cautious with their stories? If they joked about the king, could they be exiled for that? So there is an interesting text. So Snorri Sturluson, who is a 13th century historian and many other things, he writes, probably it's him, it's not certain, but let's just say it's him. He writes a compilation of sagas, stories about the Norwegian kings, and he says at the beginning that he is using Skaldic poetry, which he believes to come from the period he's writing about, because he thinks it's a good and reliable source. And one of the reasons is because it's got this type form, like I talked about. But another reason is that he says that nobody would dare to speak before the king something that could be taken as mockery. Okay, so he says if it's praise, we can take it as reliable, because nobody would dare to exaggerate so much in front of the person that they're talking about, or to make any other kind of mockery, I guess we could include in that. So yes, basically, I guess the short answer is you're going to have to be on your guard in front of the king. Again, the Icelandic laws, the later Icelandic laws, legislate against making mocking poetry about the king of Norway or Sweden or Denmark. Probably in the situation, it's a more immediate problem. I think that you would very quickly lose your job and your life if the king figured out that you were insulting him. There are some instances, some suggestions that kings didn't actually like having poets around, because so King, I think it's Olafur Haraldsson, a poet comes to his court and says, I want to be your court poet, I want to write praise poetry for you, and he says, nah, I don't really like poets, I don't like poetry, I don't understand it. So there's possibly a suggestion there that he is a bit worried that there might be kind of double meanings going on. But he gets converted to the wonders of Skaldic poetry, and he actually becomes a poet himself as well. I would be really interested in learning more about Skaldic poetry. Can you recommend books? Yep. So shall I maybe put in the chat? Can I use the chat? Well, I don't want to lose my place in the chat, but 1 second. Here's one I prepared earlier. A History of Old Norse Poetry and Poetics by Margaret Clunies Ross. I don't know if you can read that properly. I'll put it in the chat at the end when I've managed to see all of the questions. That's a pretty good introduction to Old Norse poetry in general, not just Skaldic poetry, but Eddic poetry, which is the type that's used for telling myths and things like that. Also, if you're interested in kind of playing around with it for yourself, there's a website. If you Google Skaldic poetry of the Scandinavian Middle Ages, you'll come across it. It's actually hosted here at the University of Aberdeen, and it's a new edition and translation and explanation of it will be the entire corpus of Skaldic poetry, and it's very interactive, and kind of you can get all kinds of really interesting information, so it's definitely worth having a play there. It's all open access. Okay, another question. Did humour bring Vikings closer like a family because they are able to share jokes and laugh with each other? I'm sure that's true. Yeah, I think, I mean, we don't have any direct evidence of that, but in comparative terms, humour is often used as like that, isn't it, for kind of creating bonds and reminiscing about particular things. So having these kind of jokes or commemorative little verses or ditties about shared experiences, I'm sure was really important in that kind of thing. Oh, thanks. Jacinta has put those references in the chat now, so anybody interested in following up, that's there. Okay, question from Kay. Thanks, Kay. Do you think elements of the Viking culture, language, and humour is still alive in Scandinavian countries today in some ways? Yeah, the language certainly. So Old Norse is very close to modern Icelandic, not identical. There's some changes in meaning, some changes in spelling, things like that. But it's much closer, for example, than modern English is to Old English, or even to Middle English. So it's very kind of closely preserved. It's got the same grammatical structures and a lot of the same kinds of vocabulary in modern Icelandic. And the other modern Scandinavian languages are all descendants of Old Norse, although generally they've gone through more grammatical and other kinds of changes. On the humour point, partly one of the reasons I got interested in this topic, well, apart from the fact that I find reading the sagas very amusing, and I was never quite sure if I was supposed to be laughing at them or not, whether it was intentionally funny. But a good few years ago, there was an article in a British newspaper claiming that in Britain we got our sense of humour from the Vikings, that our sense of humour was kind of imported from the Viking Age. Now, you know, there's no gene for humour, so any kind of direct correspondence is a bit like facile, I suppose, to say something like that. But I think the fact that we can actually recognise, especially the little one-liners and the kind of sarcastic kind of comments, we can still find those amusing now. I'm not Scandinavian, so I won't make any claims about the modern Scandinavian sense of humour. But I think there's a kind of some quite surprising and pleasing overlaps between how we can access humour, and less so with poetry, but maybe with the puns and the one-liners, we still get what they were going on about. Good question. Okay, question Avery. Like Monty Python's familiarity with Norse poetry, are there other examples of modern comedy or comedians being influenced by Viking comedy? That is a really interesting question. Nothing really comes to mind, but that's probably because I'm not really as acquainted with modern popular humour and comedy as. Actually, I'll tell you what, the Netflix series Norsemen, watching that is a lot like reading a saga. Okay, it's really, really ultra violent. It's really black kind of humour, really like tasteless. But a lot of it is, so it's completely like part of the humour of it is like anachronism. It's not trying to portray a kind of realistic situation. It makes fun of the present almost as much as it does of the past. But there's something about its tone, I would say, that would suggest that its creators are very familiar with the type of humour and the type of what goes on, how it's portrayed in the Old Norse sagas. So that's something to check out if you haven't. Okay, what are the instances of humour regarding females in the Viking era? Yeah, another good question. So there's a lot of poetry again about, well, there's a lot of sexualized poetry about women in the Viking Age, which again is perhaps not supposed to be hilariously funny, but it's more really about the honour of the men involved, perhaps, than laughing at the women, because women were not expected. They didn't really have the same status as men in terms of the kind of humour and revenge aspect, or insult and revenge aspect. So a woman would be seen as a bit beneath you to make jokes about women, unless you were doing it to actually target their father or their husband or whatever. So at least from the evidence we've got, the stories tend to be more about the kind of rivalry and feuding between men. But women are important in this, I think, because to be laughed at by a woman was the kind of ultimate like social death, like the worst thing that could happen to you. So again, we have poetry from the Viking age, which it's not itself humorous, but it's kind of saying, I'm going to go out and be really brave because I don't want the girls to laugh at me. So I think women and women's laughter are kind of important social regulators, actually. So men were kind of spurred on to be manly by the fear that women were going to laugh at them. And if women did laugh at them, then they often had to prove themselves to be manly. And unfortunately, evidence suggests that might be, you know, through taking out through the ultimate way of proving your masculinity against a woman, but through physical violence and sexual violence against a woman. So I think there's a lot actually we can learn about Viking Age society and gender relationships through that dynamic. Good question. Okay, question from Alistair. Do you think it's possible to trace a direct line from Viking humour to contemporary Scandinavian literature and super dark humour, or have subsequent influences also come into play and superseded them? I guess like with the Northmen thing, there is perhaps a later a revisiting type thing going on, but in some cases at least we can't necessarily say that the sagas were always being known and told in that form, at least outside of Iceland. They're more kind of rediscovered in the kind of early modern period. So they're quite well known in Iceland probably all the way through, but elsewhere in Scandinavia and Europe and everywhere else, we can't say it's a direct continuation, but more a rediscovering, I suppose. Like the point about how the importance of how a joke is taken, Snegli Hallfreðar offers a couple of examples of where the joke is on the king and he takes it surprisingly well, certainly better than his wife does. Yeah, that's a good example. Snegli Hallfreðar, very offensive stuff going on there. Hatli, an Icelander, an Icelandic poet, very rude to the king in that instance. That's a really good example, thank you. But again, the king is perhaps someone that can afford to laugh things off, to take it as a joke, because he's the king, right? He's got an abundance of honour already. So again, it's interesting that the wife maybe doesn't take it as well, because like I say, the woman has an important role in regulating honour and behaving in a masculine way, but you know, the king he's not worried. He's not worried. He just engages in this kind of banter, even though it is phenomenally rude. We have recently had archaeological evidence of strong women Vikings. Does any of the poetry reflect this, with the woman coming out ahead? Think of an example. Unfortunately, we don't have that much poetry by women that exists. We know that there were women poets, and probably more than we have examples for. It's just that it's not necessarily the kind of thing that was thought worthy of preserving. There's certainly lots of stories and examples in the sagas where women come out ahead, women have linguistic skills and get the better of men, but unfortunately, at least not that I can think of off the top of my head, not so many poetic examples, but yeah, definitely something that the sagas are interested in talking about, and good, really interesting women characters in the sagas as well. Question from Peter: do you think there was a humour to the nicknames which appear in the sagas? I strongly suspect so, yeah. It's kind of theorised that some of the nicknames are ironic rather than descriptive, so, you know, maybe Þorgils the Tall was really short and that kind of thing. There are also nicknames that are probably supposed to be, again, not very flattering or quite insulting, but which are probably kind of funny. So the one that comes to mind is Eystein Foul Fart. Again, you know, can't go wrong with a bit of bodily humour. Yeah, and I suspect there are many more like that that have a kind of ironic sense to them, or that they are given in order to commemorate something really embarrassing that happened to someone once. It's just that we don't usually know the story. Only very few cases do we know the story of why someone got a nickname. So that's the kind of thing that, unfortunately, is a bit of an in-joke perhaps, and is kind of lost to us now. But there's certainly plenty to speculate through some really good nicknames. Great, Catherine. Have elements of humour in Scandinavia today. Excellent, good to hear. Don't want to claim it myself, but thank you, Catherine, for contributing that. Any evidence of Viking humour from the female perspective? I kind of answered that question, that we unfortunately don't have any or much poetic evidence, but certainly in the sagas, again, so it's not really Viking exactly, it's coming from the medieval period, but there's certainly women who can compete with the men in terms of snappy one-liners and throwing around puns and insults. So something that it's not ruled out for women. We just don't have quite as much evidence of it. Was humour kind of equal ground between all ranks, or was it kept to commoners with other commoners, nobles with other nobles? Thanks, Miranda. That's an interesting question. I'd say it crosses ranks, but like in today's society, punching down isn't really all that cool. You don't gain that much from punching down on someone. So it's more punching across to someone who you actually kind of a rival to, or punching up, I suppose. So again, like from the evidence we've got, if you're doing it in order to gain honour, then you're better off targeting someone of a similar rank to you, where you can like slightly increase your honour in comparison, rather than, it's not going to be honourable to kind of insult a servant or whatever, because like with women, they're not really expected to be in a position to fight back. It's just not a nice thing to do. Okay, a question from Amber. Thank you very, very much for all the questions. I know that we're running short of time, so I'm trying to talk fast now, but it's great to see that there are so many questions. Thank you. Would you say that the fact that libel, especially when in poetic form, was punishable by law, has more to do with the perceived slight or the medium through which it came? I'm thinking of the high value that was given to Skaldic poetry. Just wondering whether the two are quite dependent on each other. So I think poetic libel is more serious than other kinds of insult or libel, precisely because it's made to be memorable. It's even if people don't understand it straight away, because it's got such a tight metrical form and rhythm and things like that. It's made to be passed on in oral society, and made to be thought about as well, because it's hard, it's like a puzzle, it's fun. So preserving something in poetry definitely made it more likely to survive and to be heard by a lot of people and thought about by a lot of people than another kind. So it is more serious in the laws as well, by degree, even though less unpoetic forms could also be quite serious as well. Bruce, thanks for that. Don't often laugh out loud when reading books, but have properly done so with sagas. Yep, definitely. Often amusing, but sometimes properly funny. An example from Hallfreðar, Sauted. Yeah, just now is somewhere being treated roughly. Yeah, lots of kind of understatement and yes, kind of sly little asides, very witty. I like them too. Do we find Viking humour in other vernaculars or Latin? Question from Ross. I'm more familiar with the Old Norse sources. Nothing comes to mind from other types of source. I mean, often like the kind of ephemeral everyday humour isn't what gets preserved. It's obviously things that are really insulting and cause a big feud that makes a good story. So that's what gets recorded. Whereas just like little throwaway lines, nobody bothers to actually write down and tell hundreds of years later. There may well be instances to be found elsewhere, but it's not something I've looked into. But very interesting. I shall have to do that. Thanks, Ross. Kath was speaking to someone from Colchester Museum, said a Viking sword had been found with the name ankle biter. Is this true, and can we have heard that they were having a laugh at a shorter Viking? Who knows? Ankle biter, it definitely rings a bell, and we know that swords were definitely given names, and some of them are kind of amusing like that. I'm not sure how. Oh, I see. So yeah, it could be that the name of the sword is ankle biter. It's the kind of, rather than the person that owns the sword. Yes, swords are often given kind of names like that. Leg biter is mentioned in the sagas, and yeah, it's probably part of the same thing, a kind of aestheticization of death, or amusing, making death, taking the fear out of it somewhat by laughing at it in a way. Why did they name the island Iceland? Yeah, when we look at the map, what's now Greenland, they might have been better saving that up, you might think, but again, there are origin stories that say, you know, they saw ice flows, or they looked into the valley and the rivers were full of ice, and so they called it Iceland. Perhaps not as appealing for attracting settlers, but they did all right with settling it anyway. Alistair, any examples of Viking humour carrying into, say, Norman culture, which otherwise assimilated so quickly into the Frankian world? Great question. I'm afraid I've got no idea. I've never looked at the Norman sources in this slide, but I definitely will. Thanks, Alistair. Carl, given all the questions about relations between medieval and modern sense of humour, I wonder to what extent the rediscovery of medieval Norse literature from the 19th century have influenced modern literature perceptions of humour. Yeah, again, not really. I've not really done the work looking back, but I think it definitely influenced 19th century views of Vikings and the Viking age and what was seen as heroic. So the bringing out of that kind of bold type humour, it definitely comes through in those 19th century translations and discussions. And Catherine, would and also the medieval Christian era since the Viking age have erased some of the female history given the position of women in Christianity? Possibly. And yes, I mean, we only have written sources post-Christianity, substantial written sources written in the Latin alphabet post-Christianity. So yeah, I mean, there's a big debate there to be had about to what extent they are deliberately trying to erase female agency. But like I say, there's plenty that does get through, in which women are very honourable, very respected. But I mean, for becoming a poet, for instance, there were just far fewer opportunities for women because they wouldn't be in a position to travel to foreign courts and to get work as a poet. So there was kind of less need for them to be trained, and just fewer stories being told about the everyday kind of situation that many women would be in compared to men. All right, I've reached the bottom of the chat, only 3 minutes over time. Thank you so much for coming along, and thank you for all those brilliant questions, really, really interesting questions. Thank you to Jacinta for moderating, and I am going to finish up, but do get in touch with us through Facebook or Twitter if any other questions occur to you. Okay, take care, everyone. Bye.